Bienvenue. Welcome, everybody. So this will be an event in English tonight, but please feel free to ask a question in French at the end, and we can translate it. So I'm very happy to have Will Potter in Montreal. I have been a fan. I've been a fan of his work for a long time. Most of what I learned about the political repression of the animal rights movement and the environmental movement come from his book. And those of you who saw my talks on direct action know that Green is the New Red is my Bible. So I'm very happy to help launch the latest book, Little Red Barns. So this event is co-sponsored by the Concordia Social Justice Center. My name is Christiane and I'm the coordinator of the center here. And we also have other co-sponsor. Hi. We have the Department of Criminology of the Toronto Metropolitan University. We have the Groupe de Recherche en Éthique Environnementale et Animale du Centre de Recherche en Éthique. We have also the prison radio show. So the audio today will be recorded and broadcast on the prison radio show. And we have also, as co-sponsor, the Concordia Food Coalition. We have the Concordia Student Union, as well as Research for the Frontlines. So I also want to thank the Shift Space here for the space, and Niloufar for the great vegan food. So the event will be facilitated by Kelly Struthers Montford, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Criminology at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her research interests lie at the nexus of captivity and power in carceral locations, such as prisons and animal agriculture. She is the co-editor of Colonialism and Animality, as well as Disability and Animality, with Chloe Taylor. And she does research in critical prison studies, green criminology, feminist criminology, critical animal studies, and socio-legal studies. And I also want to thank Stephanie, who will take care of the Zoom tonight. So I'll leave it to you, Kelly.
Hello, everyone. As Christiane mentioned, I'm Kelly, and I'm an associate professor of criminology at Toronto Metropolitan University. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the book launch for Will Potter's Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as custodians of the land and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many nations. Today, it is a home to a diverse population of Indigenous persons from all around the world that come through various processes have come to call so-called Canada home. And it is with respect to the continued connections with the past, present, and future that our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other persons within the Montreal community, that our commitment to reconciliation and anti-colonialism is grounded, and that motivates our Indigenous, racial, animal, and environmental justice work, in which questions of territory are ever present. With that in mind, I'm reminded of the words of Patrick Wolfe, a settler Australian scholar, contributed to settler colonial studies, who wrote that territoriality is settler colonialism's specific, irreducible element, as it is the foundation of colonial state formation, suppression of Indigenous resistance in order to facilitate continued access to territory that resecures the singularity of the settler state and provides its material basis. Suppressing land defenders, environmental activists, and animal activists through the deployment of the state's carceral arm continues the settler state's access to land for extraction to the detriment of all life. Canada is adopting many of the carceral strategies that Will's previous work has brought to the fore. To name just a few examples, In 2021, Wet'suwet'en land defenders Molly Wickham, Shaylin Sampson, and Corey Jocko were arrested in 2021 for breaking an injunction against blocking the Coastal GasLink pipeline project through their unceded territories. This April, 10 environmental activists were convicted for participating in a blockade at an oil terminal in the city. While they will not serve formal prison time, they do now have criminal records, and right-leaning media has framed this as judicial leniency. Multiple provinces, 4 and counting, have quickly pushed through ag-gag laws, often following animal and environmental protests, including those at a dog sledding facility and rail blockades in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en land defenders, and a federal ag-gag law has been attempted. I would also be remiss to not attend to the role of the university in the settler control of territory and its collaboration with state legal systems. Indeed, in January of this year, the Supreme Court of Canada denied hearing the appeal of the Mohawk Mothers, a group of elders and land custodians who since 2015 have used legal and extra-legal tactics of resistance to try and pause the expansion of McGill University on Royal Victoria grounds. Not only are the lands in question unceded, but they are likely the unmarked graves of Indigenous children who died due to the neglect or due to mistreatment at the hands of medical and educational institutions, including being subjected to torture during CIA psychiatric experiments. Concordia, for its part, has its own story of the Grey Nuns, which tells similar tales of colonial violence, coercive removal of children, their incarceration, abuse, and torture, and its administration has not actioned reconciliation outside of offering land acknowledgements. It is this diagnosis of the threads linking the collusion between the state and corporations to suppress environmental and animal justice movements at the same time that white supremacist groups are emboldened by the state's willful ignorance and or direct platforming of them that brings Will Potter here tonight for these important conversations. Will Potter is an award-winning investigative journalist who exposes political repression and the erosion of civil liberties. His landmark book, Green is the New Red, revealed how governments and corporations have labeled nonviolent animal rights activists and environmental activists as terrorists. His new book, which we are here to talk about tonight, Little Red Barns, is the result of a 10-year investigation into factory farms and rising fascism. This book is Will Potter's most ambitious and wide-ranging investigation yet. What begins as a study of factory farms and undercover investigations expands into a sweeping narrative about political power, ecological collapse, corporate secrecy, and far-right authoritarianism. Potter argues that the Little Red Barn, an omnipresent symbol in American and Canadian childhood stories and food packaging, functions as a cultural shield, hiding not only the real conditions of modern industrial farming, but also the growing political machinery designed to suppress dissent. Potter shows how the agricultural industry, shaken by the political impact of undercover investigations, responded by lobbying for harsh ag-gag laws that criminalize filming inside farms, prohibit whistleblowing, and in some cases classify simple documentation as domestic terrorism. He tells not only a story about factory farms and the animals and the workers who live and work there, but also a story about censorship and democratic erosion and the loss of civil liberties. So please help me in welcoming Will.
That's the extent of. Thank you to Kelly and Christiane for that very kind introduction. It really means a lot to me. Places like this where people are making these types of connections across movements and across backgrounds to think about how these issues of social justice are so intersectional. And I especially want to thank Christiane for all the work that went into it and the incredible food. This is like a rarity to have a talk, free talk, and such great food. Kelly and I met several years ago now at the University of Denver, based on her work connecting carceral systems and settler colonialism to environmental and animal activism. And so, in short, it's just a real pleasure to be here and to have this kind of be pulling out extra chairs from the back is always a very nice thing to see after you've been stuck to your desk for 10 years working on a project and you don't know if anybody's going to give a shit. So thank you to everybody on Zoom for joining all over the place. Tonight I'm going to be, as Kelly indicated, kind of stitching together a few different threads of thinking of this investigation. We're going to be talking about factory farms and attacks on civil liberties and human rights, the rise of fascism, ecological collapse. You're in for real light. This is what we call a beach read in the publishing industry. So I appreciate you all sitting through it. But to start, we begin with the farm. How many of you had a toy set like this growing up? Or maybe you had the picture books, or this Old MacDonald, right? We'll talk about that in a minute too. It might be the most common and well-known song in human history. It's translated to dozens of languages around the world. Even countries that didn't have historically Little Red Barns know this story. And it's a story that we've been told our entire lives. We learn this story before we even learn in the US, the Pledge of Allegiance, before we learn stories about God and country and gender and masculinity and all these other things, capitalism. We know this story before we even know our ABCs, right? And trying to do the wrong thing here. Over the years, that story, we've become more and more removed from agriculture. Just a couple generations ago, most people had some connection to where their food came from, not just animal agriculture, but knowing farmers personally, knowing the community and what crops were raised, what was in season, what was local. Now we are replaced with what the industry refers to as agricultural literacy, that we don't know much at all where our food comes from. If we need food, we go to the grocery store. If we're that privileged and we have money, right? When we go to a restaurant, a little bit louder. But around 2000, starting in the early 2000s, that started to shift in really radical ways. There were a couple things happening. There was an increased availability of technology that became much cheaper. So for journalists like me, it used to be really cost prohibitive to do these types of investigations. And even if you could do them, you couldn't get them placed in media outlets, right? You were dependent on corporate media structures. And on top of that, there wasn't like a campaign element to it. You actually had to send physical VHS tapes to the news outlets, and sometimes they might just trash it. Maybe they'll use it, but you have no control over the story. And the rise of undercover investigations, largely by nonprofit animal protection groups, completely changed that. All of a sudden, you had technology that was accessible. You could distribute it freely on YouTube and on social media platforms. And through those social in particular, you could get hundreds of thousands or even millions of views, make international headlines. And all of a sudden, you had journalists like me turning to these types of investigators for help doing the work as mainstream media budgets are being decimated. Okay. Does that landscape make sense to you all? It's really important to understand him because that was such a fast shift that it completely rattled the industry. These investigations exposed horrific animal cruelty, egregious acts of violence like sexually abusing animals, punching and kicking, beating them with steel pipes and bats and batons. It also led to significant public health concerns. This was a landmark case in California where cows that were too sick to walk were being pushed by front loaders, by heavy equipment, to try to get them into the kill floor. Now, those are so common in the industry, they're called downer cows. Because of the conditions of factory farming, animals get sick, they can't move. The industry wants to get that last every bit of money, right? So they're trying to get them into the food supply. The reason that's so dangerous is even if you eat animal products, you can be eating sick animals. And in this case, these animals were being fed to children as part of the national school lunch program. So that investigation led to the largest recall in US history. Beyond that, these investigations showed what most people had no idea were actually standard industry practices. That Little Red Barn being replaced by industrial systems. This was an investigation in 2012 in Canada by Diversity for Animals. And the industry's response to so much of this was just digging in their heels and defending it, saying, well, body slamming piglets to death is humane. This is just how we do things. Cutting the beaks off of chickens without anesthesia, the tails off of pigs, the docking, and all of those systems are just business as usual. Now, as these investigations were coming out, it wasn't just a media campaign. They were being used to introduce new legal standards. In the US, we call them ballot initiatives, which means that voters can introduce their own proposals to have voted by the population at large. And those standards were eliminating the worst of the worst standard industry practices. Oh no. We just skip ahead. You didn't see that. They've also led to, there's a Michigan State study, it was overwhelming public support for these type of proposals. When consumers were exposed to what happens every day on these industrial farms, people were outraged and they wanted to see these policies go away. Activist groups use these in pressure campaigns against companies like Domino's and Burger King, McDonald's, Subway, Wendy's, all the big fast food chains and grocery stores, to get them to cut ties, saying, hey, this is what we've exposed. Now we're going to go to you, the grocery chain or the fast food chain, and say, you need to do something about this and remove this supply. And finally, in my research, there's also a growing amount of research that when consumers are exposed to these types of stories, they actually respond by trying to shift where they purchase from, but also reducing their consumption of animals. So all of this, in short, is the threat posed by exposure. Now, before we go a little bit further into what the industry did to respond to that, I think we have to set it up a little bit. And I really appreciate Christiane's very kind introduction and Kelly's about my first book, Green is the New Red. And at the time, I mean, for decades now, I've been trying to sound the alarm of what happens as we steadily erode and chip away at more and more types of protest activity as terrorism. First, it started with underground groups and direct action, breaking windows, stealing animals, setting SUVs on fire. Then it started spreading to civil disobedience and more mainstream activity. All of this started, this terrorism rhetoric was invented by these corporations. In Green is the New Red, I talk about how in the mid-1980s, they just made up the term eco-terrorism. They invented it. And then they went through a series of public relations campaigns and lobbying. They did things like this. I don't know if you guys in Canada, do you know Steve Urkel? Some of you, very Steve Urkel vibes, or maybe like a little Montreal hipster, perhaps, with like big glasses, right? The balaclava. But this was Meet the World's Newest Terrorist. Don't Tolerate Terrorism in America. This was sponsored by the Burns. So they started doing these things to introduce this new language and make it commonplace. And eventually, through their lobbying power, they worked it up to the top levels of government. So the FBI, for many years, publicly stated that animal rights and environmental activists who have never harmed a single human being were their stated #1 domestic terrorism threat. This was at a time that people like right-wing groups and white supremacists were sending chemical weapons, they were plotting mass shooter events, there were attacks on synagogues and mosques. During all of this time, animal and environmental activists were the FBI's top priority. And this is probably my favorite example from years ago of how all of this was talked about. You can see here that the true threat of the animal rights terrorists is that they've taught lobsters to crawl on land. They've taught owls to carry dynamite. The women don't shave their legs, but I think most disturbing of all, we can all agree, is that men do. This is the kind of cultural warfare narrative pushed. And this, by the way, was from the National Rifle Association. So I just have to say, as a Texan, you would think that the group that is obsessed with like fetishizing weapons and guns might be like down with this, but this is the threat. And no matter how absurd all of that sounds, it worked its way to the top levels of the FBI. and also was used in new legislation like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act in the US. And I bring this up, these are the groups that worked on it behind the scenes. I found out about this coalition because someone leaked to me the internal lobbying website of the groups behind it. And being a good, hard-hitting journalist, I entered the username of test and the password of
Password?
close. That was my first one. It was
Admin?
also test. And they had like a little profile on me as the opposition. They had all this stuff, but they showed who behind the scenes. And it's interesting because it's not just people like the beef industry. It was universities. I mean, Kelly set this up in her introduction, the role and collaboration between often academia and the state, and both in colonialism and in repression. You had companies like GlaxoSmithKline. Now, when I testified before Congress as the only person opposing this legislation, it was the FBI, Homeland Security, GlaxoSmithKline, and these industry reps. And it didn't go very well. They were quite hostile, and they responded to my concerns that this type of legislation would be used against civil disobedience and undercover investigations, is specifically what I warned Congress. And they reacted so vehemently. Mr. Potter, you need to take a logic course, is what I was told. This is never going to happen. You're scaremongering, you're exaggerating, you have no evidence of this. The FBI sat there and said, we would never do something like that. And then what do you know? We got the documents. And that testimony was in 2005. This was in 2003, where they have open investigations based on videotaping the conditions of animals that were, in this case, the subject of a major investigation and open rescue that made media headlines around the world. We also got working with a former FBI agent, sent me these. These are training materials used by the FBI to brief new FBI agents in rooms, maybe not like this one, but this kind of PowerPoint presentation, where they're instructing, you all get to be the FBI agents, instructing you all how you should view these threats. And what's interesting is if you look at the rest of the presentations, when they're talking about right-wing groups, mass violence, arms accumulation, bombings, anthrax. When they're talking about animal rights and environmental groups, public relations war. Media is a vital part of every action, and God forbid, sometimes it's slanted in the favor of activists. All of this set the stage for something that was really humbling for me to watch unfold. As I'm immersed in this, I'm trying to sound the alarm about worst case scenario. And in some ways, the worst case scenario just exceeded my expectations of what was possible. Because the same year that Green is the New Red came out, a wave of bills were introduced across the country in the US called ag-gag laws. Ag is for agriculture and gag is to silence. And these are laws that were specifically targeting undercover investigations by these groups and by journalists, by the way, classifying them often as terrorism and hitting them with disproportionate penalties in order to stop that activity. They're really, for our purposes, I won't get too nerdy about the legal parlance and the minutia of how these laws work, but you need to know that there have been really three main types. This started as bans on photography. And what do you know when corporations and the state start trying to censor information and shut down journalism? The public kind of wants to know what's being hidden, right? It's kind of like banned books. I was the dork who read the banned books because I found out about that in grade school. Like, oh man, what are they trying to censor in my school district in Texas? Those are the things you want to see, right? So this type backfired, and it led to a lot of public opposition, including from the industry itself. So then they shifted it up a little bit, and they started talking about misrepresentation. So that means, and I'm sure none of you all would ever exaggerate, especially the students here, as you're applying for a job or a fellowship, you would never just kind of blow up and inflate your expertise or your work experience, right? If you do that in the context of applying for a job on one of these farms, that becomes a terrorism offense. If you don't disclose, for instance, someone like me, and I did apply for jobs undercover, and I did get offered several of them, If you don't disclose, hey, I'm also an investigative journalist, that's misrepresentation. And of course, aren't going to disclose those things. You're not going to be able to do the work. The third type, I think, is the most dangerous and perhaps the most kind of insidious. And that was classifying what the industry said was mandatory reporting. So their story became, hey, we had no idea what was happening every single day on our farms. This is all new to us. I can't believe what you're exposing. This is clearly the work of a few bad apples, immigrants and brown people, right? Those are overwhelmingly who work on these farms. So the executives were trying to shift the blame into people who don't have money, who don't have resources, who don't have political power, and tell them that they need to turn over their footage. If you see something, say something, right? That's what we say in the States. You have to turn over your footage in 24 or 48 hours to police. Now, if you're undocumented, and even years ago, this was the case, you don't have access to lawyers. You don't feel comfortable going forward to your employer and telling them you saw the bad shit that they're doing every single day, right? It's shifting all of that burden onto people who have the least amount of power. The rhetoric of the industry this whole time was, we don't need activists to police us. We can do it ourselves. Which is a funny statement because they also don't want the government to police them. In the US, the Animal Welfare Act defines animals to not include animals on farms. So by law, they are not animals, so anything you do to them can't be animal cruelty, right? You see how clever that is? It's the same case for most animals in laboratories as well. So as a result, you have a system that has between 9 and 10 billion animals raised for food just in the US alone, with no federal system of oversight for animals as they're alive. And then at the state level, and I know this is similar in Canada as well, you have exemptions for what the industry defines as custom and standard practices. So if one of those corporate industry groups I put up on the screen says, hey, it's normal for us to keep pigs in gestation crates, to keep them separated from their offspring, where they never turn around, they can't even scratch an itch, they can't roll over, they never see sunlight. If the industry says that's how they do things, it by law can't be considered cruelty. Is this making sense so far? Yeah. So this is the landscape. I wanted to include this because I was getting in a lot of, as you might imagine, some heated debates on TV and conversations in the press with industry people. And their defense of this kept evolving to the point that they were actually comparing their need for these ag-gag laws to hate crimes, saying it was no different than passing laws against burning crosses in front of Black people's lawns to terrorize them. No different than defacing churches or mosques because someone's religion or someone's sexual orientation. This is significant because they're rewriting the story. All of a sudden, I was seeing that it wasn't the animals who were the victims. It wasn't the workers. It wasn't the farm communities. It was the farmers, right? It was the industry farmers, not the small farmers. It was these industrial operations. And it's not just a rhetorical push that the way this worked, this was an investigation that actually led to a slaughterhouse being shut down, which never happens, right? It never happens. That's how bad this footage was. And this wasn't even the worth of it, this screenshot. And I promise there's not going to be a lot of just gruesome stuff throughout here. But the industry put pressure on elected officials, and people like Devin Nunes reopened the slaughterhouse, saying that the factory farm and the abattoirs were victims of economic terrorism by being filmed and exposed. Now, I won't go too much into the weeds of this, but I think you all need to know kind of the networks that allowed this to happen. One of the ones that I uncovered in my investigation is called ALEC. Have you heard of ALEC? Okay, ALEC is a corporate front group in the States. The way it works is that elected officials at the state level go to ALEC conferences paid by ALEC that are sponsored by all of those corporations, Pfizer, Wyeth, GlaxoSmithKline, all of the big players. And as those state representatives are going off to Broadway shows and steakhouse dinners paid for by corporations, the corporate reps stay behind and they are actually drafting legislation. And then those elected officials come back from their fancy dinners and their plays and all of their, jet skiing and the stuff the industry pays for. And they take those model bills and they introduce them around the country, and people have no idea that it was written by industry. This is Iowa Governor Terry Branstad. This is one of the first states to pass ag-gag. He is a proud member of ALEC. I found this in going through his Facebook page. He is wearing beef industry merch, which is kind of ridiculous merch, but I guess everybody uses merch these days. In Texas, we'd call this the good old boy network. It's just this idea. I mean, these are largely like old school white men, traditional so-called values, helping each other out. But these corporate and elected officials' ties are how these bills get passed. So as I was seeing all this unfold, as I mentioned, the kind of nerdy, well, still nerdy, but the younger version of me reading those banned books, as a journalist, when people are banning information, I want to figure out new ways of getting the information, right? So I started doing drone investigations. And at the time, this was a very gray area. After talking to a bunch of lawyers who were like, yeah, maybe. I was like, okay, we're going to do this. And my main motivation was both defiance to these laws as a journalist, but also to expand the narrative. Because it's not only the animal cruelty that's being hidden, it's the environmental impact of these facilities. These are one of the top contributors to climate change, species loss, algae blooms, water pollution, rising cancer and asthma rates in local communities. The list goes on. And in Little Red Barns, I go very in depth of the environmental consequences backed by peer-reviewed research, which has become the consensus now of how dangerous these facilities are, but also all the ways that they're hiding this from the public. When the international climate conferences started getting this research about how bad these facilities are, the industry responded by doubling and tripling the number of representatives they're sending to international climate conferences. And as they're there, not surprising thing happens that they're putting pressure on international bodies to strip any mention of animal agriculture from climate reports. Not only that, but I went through and I showed the receipts in the book of how they do this, of removing mentions of plant-based diets, removing mentions of even the suggestion that we move away from industrial agriculture. The heavy meat producing countries, especially like Brazil, Argentina, and the United States, were at the forefront of censoring all of that from the reports that the entire world is using to shape their climate policies, right? Does that make any sense how dangerous this is? These facilities, and I liked this shot in particular because this is what it's like passing some of these farms. This isn't even a big one, by the way. I didn't go after the worst of the worst. I was just trying to go for kind of the middle, so I wouldn't be accused of like selectively picking. But you see this row of trees here? So you're going down the country road, you feel the smell of this. You feel the weight of these, what the industry calls lagoons. These lagoons are coming from a dairy operation. Now, if you think of the little red barns of our imagination, the little happy animals walk the pasture, they eat grass, they poop in the field, the poop goes into the earth. Nature is a beautiful thing, even with feces, right? It's regenerative. When you confine thousands and tens of thousands, or in the case of battery cages for birds, you can have hundreds of thousands or millions of birds on a single operation. That waste has to go someplace. It can't stay on the concrete. So it gets piped out into these giant pits that you can see over here. The waste kind of congeals as it's moved through the system. And these are pipelines to give you an idea of the sexy life of investigative journalism, I went to some industry trade shows where there's entire trade shows about the poop management systems, right? And it's not poop. And I talk about this in the book. It's feces mixed with antibiotics and hormones and other waste that makes this so noxious. So as that waste is moved around, it's then kind of had things out of order. We'll go back to Helen in a minute. We'll talk about Helen. The reason I started to shift my thinking in this investigation, I lost a drone, which this is what happens when you try to be ambitious with tech and journalism. Completely freaking out, panic attack on the side of the road. Like, I had raised money for this, I'm completely fucking up, I lost the drone. How do I salvage this? I started making like frantic calls to friends and lawyers, and they were like, okay, where you are, you need to go talk to Helen. This was in Yakima, Washington. Helen is not a radical activist. She moved out to the country with her husband, wanting the little red barn, right? Wanting the green fields. I met up with her, and I'll never forget, I talk about in the book, her giving a tour of her home, and she's sweeping up dead flies because she can't open the windows anymore, right? She was spraying this gas station perfume that her husband bought for her, just trying to mask the smell, and just kept apologizing to me and my videographer of like how embarrassed she was to have someone come into her home and this is what she's living in. And Helen responded with a group of friends that she called the grannies. They went out with disposable cameras and they just started taking photos. They documented scenes like this when she took me around her community. Now, this is another dairy operation. You can see the animals just standing in their own waste, but right out of frame is what years of lawsuits accomplished, which was a curb. And they had to put a curb there because there was so much shit coming out of these facilities that it got to the point the post office couldn't even deliver mail. They couldn't drive down the street. One of the most chilling and personally affecting scenes that I saw, at one point, she was warning me, like, I'm going to go home from what she called the poop tour and be sick. I was like, Helen, I've been through this before. I've been on a lot of farms. I'll be all right. And she's like, no, sweetheart, I haven't been on places like this. And eventually my asthma, well, it was bad at the start, but it started getting to the point like I would pull over and I was kind of having a real hard time. So we went to a hilltop and we looked out, and all of these fields had what looked like sprinklers on. And I knew about this system, right, from research and the trade shows and whatever, but I hadn't ever seen it in full force at that time. As they're spraying the shit from the lagoons onto fields. And they have to spray it because you can't have the waste too concentrated, it burns out the cropland. Right? What happens when you're aerating toxic waste full of antibiotics and fecal sludge and hormones and everything else, it's making it airborne. And as we're driving through this town, you see the workers' homes and dilapidated play sets for kids. And I just kept thinking about growing up on family farms in Texas, having asthma attacks around the animals. I mean, how many of these kids don't have inhalers? How many of them are undocumented? How many of them can't go to the doctor and have to breathe in this constantly? And sure enough, when I got home, I was sick for weeks. I had to go on steroids. It was as bad as she predicted. I'll spare you the details of what I did, like a sinus rinse, what came out, to give you an idea. And it rattled me because I thought I understood this story as one of censorship. And how could we be missing people like Helen? Like, okay, maybe we're seeing the animals more with these videos. We're not ever hearing about the farm communities. We're not hearing about those workers. We're not hearing about those kids without inhalers. And yet we have more access to this information than ever before. And at the time, I was a visiting professor at the University of Michigan, consumed with storytelling. I was teaching journalism students, I was teaching narrative nonfiction. I had a special kind of fancy pants appointment from the president's office where I was training faculty and staff at places like Harvard and MIT in how to use storytelling to reach the public with academic research. And every day I was commuting by motorcycle back and forth to my own farm in rural Michigan, passing these little red barns. And I must have done that literally hundreds of times. And then finally one day I just saw that this isn't just about censorship through laws and repression, it's censorship through the narrative that we grew up on. And I warn you that once you start seeing the little red barn, you see them everywhere. These were just my buddy Oliver, who did the cover of the book, went out to his grocery store in LA and he just started snapping photos of everywhere he saw them. This was in Vancouver. We have entire grocery stores named the Red Barn Market. A Red Barn by Marriott. It gets worse, by the way. Fairfield is a major ag operation. They market themselves as like a higher end product, but it's been exposed just like all the rest. And they offer Bon Appetit magazine described them as the Disneyland of agricultural tourism. How many of y'all have had the field trips when you're little? You go to the petting zoo, right? Well, they do that, but you can learn about what a farm is like through bouncy houses and rope climbs. And you can even see virtual reality where like an animated cow is telling you how great the animals have it. And to really cap it off, you can stay at the Marriott that's shaped like a little red barn. So I got a little obsessed with this, of how did I miss this growing up in Texas with family members who worked on factory farms? Like, how did I not see this connection? And so I started looking into the other histories of the narratives we tell about farms. You guys know Old MacDonald? Want to say it? Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-A-O, right? He had a cow. What was it? He had a cow. The cow goes.
He had like.
There you go. And so it's the cow goes moo, the pig goes oink, right? That's not where the song started. I went through the archives and started talking to historians about where Old MacDonald originated, which has been translated into hundreds of languages. There's a great Wikipedia page about it, by the way. And it goes back to some of its earliest references were in 1706 by Thomas de Urfried. And the original versions of that had lyrics like, "We defy all care and strife in a charming country life." The origins of this song were about community. They were about family. They were about what it feels like to live in a farm town. Now think about the significance that our version that we're raised with doesn't talk about community, doesn't talk about the farm town, is just a cow goes moo and a pig goes oink, right? That's the narrative we're raised on. So I thought I had a grasp on this story. And as I talk about in the book, at one point, this was a 3-book series. At one point, it got down to a PDF because I wanted done with the stupid thing. And then January 6th happened. And it kind of broke my brain. Because all of a sudden, you had not just the MAGA crowd, but you had people in the Capitol Rotunda that for people like me that monitor far-right groups, they were avowed white supremacists. They were avowed Aryan Nation, 3% militia groups that were in the Capitol. These weren't just like, oh, we wanted to come to a Trump protest. It was being orchestrated by very dangerous folks. And I got into some heated conversations with other journalists who were repeating the FBI's talking points that needed more power. The FBI said, hey, we're not able to stop things like this because our domestic terrorism laws don't allow it. But the police were killed here. And meanwhile, the FBI for decades has gone after people doing civil disobedience as terrorism in the name of the environment. And I just couldn't wrap my head around, well, on a personal level, like this has been my life. Like, and I would like to think that in these, I'm speaking before government bodies, like somebody heard something, and then it just was all erased. All of the repression that these movements have experienced just disappeared. And the FBI said they needed more power. So I went on another motorcycle ride. And can you tell this is my coping mechanism? In Michigan in winter, which is a terrible idea. And on the way back, I had to slow down because it was so cold and I couldn't keep up the speed. And I saw those little red barns again. And except at this time, they all had Blue Lives Matter and Trump signs. And something clicked that this red barn isn't just the story of farms, it's a much bigger narrative. The far right loves to have press conferences in front of red barns and with farmers, right? And if you think about it, I would argue this is the foundational myth that we're taught. It's not just the farm. Think about that little red barn. You have the happy farmer. The happy farmer has a wife, right? That happy farmer has the shotgun, is a manly man. That happy farmer has the American flag flying out front. That happy farmer hates communists and dissidents, right? There's so much baked into this that I started to see these two parts of my work of focusing on factory farms and rising fascism converging. And sometimes it's like overt. I saw this bumper sticker the other day on somebody's truck, and you can get it on Amazon. Somebody's truck in Colorado. Eat beef. The West wasn't won on salad. Right? So this both nationalism, settler colonialism, and masculinity all wrapped up into this narrative. But it's even worse than that. Historically, fascists have always used rhetoric of animals to dehumanize and to signal violence, right? Whether it's Hitler calling Jews cockroaches, whether it's we see this repeatedly all over the world. The Trump boys calling Black Lives Matter protesters animals, savages. In the recent election, the stuff about Haitians eating cats and dogs was a big story. We've had white supremacist groups showing up to chug milk, raw milk. Hear me out. They say it's a sign of racial superiority. Anybody know why? Hazard a guess? Kelly does.
You can digest lactose.
They can digest lactose. You know who can't? Largely Asian folks and Black at the highest rates, Asian folks in particular. So this isn't just a new trope either. I went into the archives again and going back over 100 years, this ability to consume raw milk was seen as a sign of racial superiority. Richard Spencer, who's kind of irrelevant now after he fuck out. But he is very tolerant, lactose intolerant. So these fascists all use these dog whistles to signal what they're about, right? Now on January 6th, you saw this invocation of the animal very directly. This goes back, again, I went into the archives and talked to historians of the KKK. Before the Klan used their white robes, they dressed as animals. They would impale runaway slaves and Black people with animal horns as a way to embrace their kind of savage Indian side, right? In their words, is how they're talking about this. Now, mainstream people like Tucker Carlson have had the author of Raw Egg Nationalism on their show, pushing the carnivore diet. This is a publishing outlet that literally publishes Nazi propaganda. You can also buy a fitness manual that's based on how Hitler's Gestapo trained, if you want to chug raw milk and get ripped, apparently. The history of this goes further, though. The guy who was kind of the architect of modern animal agriculture industrial systems, Ezra Taft Benson, he was also a rabid anti-communist and collaborated with the FBI to go after civil rights groups. Here he wrote the foreword to a book that has the severed head of a very racist caricature of a Black man with a sickle and hammer bleeding out. The company that now has most of the contracts for monitoring prisoners and migrants, GPS tracking, they actually started monitoring cattle. And then they saw it more lucrative to use it against prisoners and minorities. In the words of the CEO, this is from the New York Times, they went from, quote, cows to cons. The history of the Border Patrol, to get this even more complicated for you all, has always been tied to colonialism and violence against, especially indigenous folks, and in Texas against Mexicans. The Porvenir massacre, which kind of was the precursor of what led to the modern Border Patrol, one of the guys who was involved in that, rounding up boys and just anyone they suspected of stealing cattle. He went on to run for office, went on after that to start what we now call the Border Patrol. And it was all in the name of kind of these merged interests of racist zealotry and protecting animal ag. Now, I don't know if you can see here, but rodeos are being sponsored by ICE and the Border Patrol and recruiting efforts. So they're directly linking these narratives to try to recruit young men in particular, giving them $50,000 bonuses and some Amazon, military cosplay to go snatch migrants off the street. Now, when I'm making these connections, I want to be really clear. This isn't a theoretical discussion to me. I went back through all of the FBI's audits, and the FBI was warned repeatedly by its own inspector general, by the West Point Military Academy, by members of Congress, congressional reports, the list goes on. And they were told, going as far back as 2003, that if you keep focusing on animal and environmental activists, the far right is going to go unchecked and people are going to die. Straight up. That was the report. And the FBI wrote back, their letter is also in this report, and they're just like, no, we don't think we should do that. This is our problem. These are extremists, they're anarchists, they're anti-fascists, environmentalists. We're going after them. I would argue that the FBI is directly complicit in the rise of the far right that we see now in the States. Now, Trump and MAGA and the broader fascist shift is a cultural moment that's bigger than that. But the FBI's focus on nonviolent protesters and not looking at people that want to kill human beings in the name of racism and white supremacy, the FBI was undoubtedly complicit about that. And hopefully if we get through and we ever have elections again in the US, we will reach a point where we're going to have congressional hearings to hold the FBI account. Now, the significance and why I'm kind of taking you all through this full journey is really a couple of things. This narrative of the Little Red Barn is hiding animal agriculture and what's happening on industrial farms. It's hiding the narratives of the far right, but it also intersects in this new model of political repression. I've been doing this long enough that now I've seen the tactics that were pioneered against animal and environmental activists spreading to other social movements directly. The Cop City protests in Atlanta, they were to shut down a police training ground, to militarize police, to attack citizens and subdue dissent. The prosecution of those activists was like, they read green is the new red and thought that was a great idea. You know what I mean? Like they saw these tactics over the years and just copied them. When I've been speaking internationally, everywhere I went, people had stories. This was in Austria. Some lawyers gave me a flyer and they're like, did you know that the FBI flew from Quantico, Virginia to Austria to brief Austrian corporations about how they could also prosecute animal and environmental activists as terrorists? The FBI is a domestic agency, folks. So back to that negligence of not focusing on threats at home, they're helping corporations spread this repression around the world. Now, I think I've already gone over our time. How are we on time, Christiane? We're okay? Do you have time to read a quick section from the book?
Finish at 8, so we have ample time.
Oh, okay. We're doing great then. How are you all doing? Are you with me still?
Yeah.
I know I'm dumping a lot, and I'm doing that because I think we have to. I don't think this piecemeal approach of talking about our different silos, to use the farm analogy, of social justice issues works anymore. I don't know how to talk about these issues, and in the book, I'm quite open about my struggle with this. As a journalist, I've always been motivated by the concept of bearing witness. That I don't know what to do to fix all of this, but I can show up, I can be out front and document, and then have the faith that others will see it too. But now we're entering this era that we're all seeing what's unfolding, right? We're all seeing it. We're seeing the genocide in Gaza. We're seeing trans people in an attempt to be exterminated in the United States. That's the rhetoric they're using. We're seeing that now in Canada. I'm just in talks with folks here, ban on gender affirming care, right? It's all spreading internationally. And so I came to this crisis of what does it mean anymore to bear witness as truth is attacked, as truth doesn't have meaning, as we have elected officials that it seems like millions of people are just okay with them lying and they want to cheer it on. It's like blood in the water, right? How do we explain that we're all watching not just the genocide in Gaza, but more journalists killed than any conflict in human history that we've recorded? The witnesses are being eradicated and people don't seem to care. And my friends, like who are Palestinian photojournalists, have been some of the kindest, bravest, most like to them, it is such a badge of honor to wear the blue vest with press on it. Right? I'll never forget my friend Iman, she was one of the first female photojournalists working in the West Bank and Gaza. And it was just such a pride to be a journalist. Like kids there want to be journalists. And they're being murdered and the world doesn't seem to give a shit. So in short, like it was not just a crisis of faith for me. I'm quite open in the book. Part of the reason this took so long is the, interconnected threads and reimagining this narrative. And part of it was just dealing with suicidal depression and PTSD for many years. Some of it from farm investigations, some of it from my own experiences being targeted, and a lot of it just watching this unfold and feeling like, I don't know what to do anymore. Like this has been not just motorcycles, but journalism is my coping mechanism. Like I feel like that's the place where I know how to behave. Like I know how to contribute. I feel calmer in those crisis moments, right? That's a very a lot of my colleagues would say the same things. Like we don't know how to function anymore. And by the end of the book, like literally the final stages of the editing process, I rewrote the last couple of chapters because I did come back to this idea of bearing witness, and I haven't given up on it. And I wanted to share a passage from that. Now, I'll give a shout out to Christiane's heavily annotated book. Makes me very, very happy. Let this be I should also preface this by saying, the concept of bearing witness also comes from the church, right? I was raised in the Catholic Church. We didn't get along that well. Journalism instead. But those concepts of bearing witness, I went through the history of that terminology, and it's always meant two things. It's to see, but it's not just to doom scroll and punish ourselves by seeing bad things. It's also to testify. And that testimony, we can have a biblical discussion of, and also in the Quran, where that comes from. It's very shared lineage, but it's to see and then to speak about what you have seen. That's what bearing witness means. It's not a passive act of consuming darkness. It's an act of defiance, of speaking out against it. And finding that kind of religious history changed me. Let this be my testimony that we have within us the ability to see it all. We can see the animals, the workers, and the Helens. We can see the environmental crisis and the fascist threat. We can see the stories hiding it all. We can also see more, let our view widen beyond this story of the farm. We can see the genocide abroad, the poverty at home. We can see our neighbors and we can see ourselves. Bearing witness to it all together doesn't make any one of these sites less egregious. It doesn't make me less of an animal advocate to see the farm workers. And it doesn't make human rights concerns less valid by acknowledging animal suffering. Instead, by seeing the stories that connect these victims, we begin to see something else entirely. Not a collection of siloed, fragmented causes, but instead a conjoined, interconnected, monstrous mess. I warn you that this approach to social issues comes with a cost. Bearing witness to the full scale of this crisis, including how we are personally implicated, is frustrating and exhausting, to put it mildly. But the more I open myself to truly witness, the more nuanced my thinking becomes, the more maddeningly complex and interconnected. Although I have maintained my values, I've moved further away from puritanical solutions or holier-than-thou rhetoric. I'm increasingly able to see my own behaviors and judgment through the eyes of the witness. Media scholar Sue Tate called this the, quote, embodied knowledge of suffering, the limit experience that defies representation. Bearing witness is more than observing injustice. It's allowing that trauma to shape you and to guide your response. This is a practice available to all of us. You don't need to be an undercover investigator or a crisis journalist. We can embrace it in our daily lives as a way of living and navigating this world. To witness is to put yourself on the front lines, physically at times, but also emotionally. To embody witnessing is to embody empathy. The more I've allowed myself to see, the more humble and connected to others I feel. Bearing witness means to face the onslaught of the world, all of its darkness and evils, and do so not just with our eyes open, but with our full hearts, so that we hold space for that suffering and allow it to change us. The fear people have, I think, is that bearing witness to suffering means your life will also be suffering. I think the opposite is true. By bearing witness, our view of the entire world changes, both shadow and light. I've now spent most of my life bearing witness to humanity at its worst. And in doing so, I have placed myself in positions where I've also been able to witness humanity at its best. Even in the most bleak stories of injustice and loss, I have seen bone-chilling heroism, empathy, and grace. By bearing witness, we take in shared pain and trauma, but through that act, somehow, miraculously, more space opens up within us, and it is love, rage, and courage that flows into it. As a journalist, this is the faith I have found in witnessing, that we are all strong enough to look, that to bear witness, even when you might be attacked or imprisoned, is an act of spiritual defiance, that if we speak about what others have seen, that when we speak about what we have seen, others will see it too, and through our collective action, our shared testimony, we will write a new story together. In that spirit, I will thank you all. What we're going to do, we have questions from Kelly and from others, and I want to also note we had some difficulty getting the books across the border, which is a first. That was not the fault of Christiane or other ones, so anyone else. So we don't have books here. We're trying to figure out why it was stopped at the border. But nevertheless, the bookstore is here doing able to take pre-orders, and they're matching the Amazon price, which is awesome, and also doing free shipping. So if you guys want a copy of the book, you can sign up at the table. Shoot, I also forgot. I'll make a quick plug. Starting a new project. It's going to be a podcast and YouTube show talking about how we navigate this burning world, and in particular with a focus on trying to reach young men. There's a pipeline fascists have always used of trying to funnel frustration in relationships and economics and jobs into far right and toxic narratives that I think is largely going unchallenged by the left. So if you're interested in that, this is just to sign up on my email list. If you want to be involved in that project, we're still building it out. We hope to be launching early in the new year, but we've got some exciting stuff coming. Connecting these dots. It's not going to be a animal or environmental activist show. It's going to be firmly anti-fascist, obviously, but also focused on how we navigate this as people and how we deal with kind of the mental and psychological toll. So with that, if folks have, thanks very much.
Well, before we have any questions, I just wanted to say, most of the horses going into Border Patrol are being trained in prisons. So they're being captured as wild, free living animals, trained by prisons.
I didn't know that. So every event, I'm learning a bit more of how interwoven this is. I did a talk at Pratt, and one of the professors grew up in a refugee camp, and she's Vietnamese, who was talking about how they weren't allowed, they were forced to have milk, even though it made everybody sick as part of this like indoctrination process. So I appreciate your saying that.
So what we'll do is we'll do one question from the room and one question from Zoom. Nate, back in. Does someone have a question?
Hi, so thank you for your talk. My name is Sarah, and I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa. And thank you. Do you want me to use the mic?
Yeah, they will. You have a mic here.
Oh, nice.
So I appreciated the ending that you read from your book, and also trying to make this link to fascism, because I think that I've encountered similar struggles to you in that I'm working on humane handling of animals in slaughterhouses. And a real challenge in my work is getting different activist groups to recognize the concerns of others. So in speaking to workers, their view is that the animals are really well treated and that they're treated well to the detriment of themselves. And the animal rights activists will see the farmers as being like horrible people who are themselves like in debt and struggling. And so there's a real lack of solidarity within these groups, and so and any solution seems to like be at the expense of the others. So sorry to do the more of a comment than a question, but I the way that you're framing this in terms of a not about animal rights or not about environmentalism, but like anti-fascism, really inspiring way of maybe bringing people together. I hope it works.
Yeah, I hope so too. But like, well, and to your point, I appreciate you sharing that. I've thought a lot about this, and I think it's in some ways like a natural human response, not to excuse it, but I'm seeing it more through the lens of, especially in social justice movements, it's just too much. And I think we have a tendency to try to narrow our gaze to make it more manageable, to make it more doable and solvable. Like, and I've encountered the same rhetoric that you're indicating. And I think it's just it's going to be a real challenge right now to get people to broaden that lens and look beyond what I think can be really tempting. You know, the kind of the holier than thou, the like, we know the right way, we're going to condemn everybody else that's a little bit different, is tempting in times like this. And it's not that different than kind of the fascist talking points. And not to say these are the same, right? Don't get me wrong, but like, we got to be careful here. Because this like very narrow gaze and reframing things that just suit our interests, I don't think it's going to get us where we need to go. So I appreciate you making those connections as well.
Oh, you don't need them. Oh, you can use the mic.
Okay, so the chat was very active during your talk. Everyone was enjoying themselves. So our first question is from Debbie Ball. what role did groups such as ACLU take in running interference on the passage of ag laws?
I'll disclose that for a number of years, I worked at the ACLU legislative office on issues like the expansion of the Patriot Act. And in some ways, that's how I got connected to testify about my reporting about the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. So I say this with love and support for the ACLU, but they dropped the ball on that. The ACLU did not oppose the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. Ag laws, however, there was a shift. And there's actually, I should have included I have too many slides. I should have included another slide. Now, one of the biggest turning points for me, I was a plaintiff in several of the lawsuits challenging ag in the US because they're a threat to my work as a journalist. And one of the biggest shifts was getting groups, not just like the ACLU, but a really broad, diverse network on board. Labor unions, workers' rights groups, public safety groups, public health groups, press freedom groups. We had a list of media organizations that started to sign on. And so to kind of connect that to the previous question as well, I think that's the way forward, is recognizing that even if the ACLU didn't speak out against the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, it still came around, and we have to like give space for people to come around and change their perspective, because it can be really significant. And I would argue that coalition, especially groups like the ACLU, the Teamsters, press freedom groups, was critical to slowing down and shutting down many of these ag proposals. In our constitutional challenges, that coalition was critical as well. Ultimately, nearly all of these laws have been struck down in the states in whole or in part. There's still a big danger there, and there's a lot more we could talk about that. But moving this beyond this animal or environmental space is what did it. So I'll say that even if groups like that might piss you off, or you don't think they're radical enough, or they didn't take the right, like, we got to have spaces where people can shift, because it really does make a huge difference in being able to win these fights. We can't do it as fragmented causes.
Hi, my name's Albert. I think one of the main narrative you had was really the convergence of different social justice movements, and that's a super interesting way forward. I was wondering, how did you feel that the animal rights movement in general is responding to that need, I think, to converge with other folks who are not vegans, maybe they don't really think about animals too much, but to really realize the importance of working together?
That's a great question. It's complicated to answer because I'm seeing a couple different things happen. I would say in the US, and I would argue internationally, the dominant, like the NGOs, the main organizations, I think part because of the nature of their work, their fundraising, their restrictions, are very focused on animals in that kind of traditional lens. I'm seeing in more of the grassroots side of things, a very strong push to make these connections. There's been a lot of division historically in these movements, and there's division now, particularly around like Gaza, around speaking out against the ICE raids of meatpacking plants, connecting these dots to like literally the people that are being snatched and deported. But to answer your question, I don't know. You know, it's tough in spaces like this. I think the people that come to my talks or are familiar with my work are naturally more receptive to that, or they know that that's how I approach things. And I have had a lot of pushback from mainstream established animal organizations of how do we do that? They say, how do we speak out about everything? We can't make a statement on every cause. What will that do to our funding? What will that do to our membership base? People support us because they want us to act on animals. If we start putting out statements about the rights of trans people, what is that going to do, right? So I think some of those concerns are also valid. I think the shift in animal advocacy to be more intersectional and talk about these things in this way will be a learning curve. And as I said to one organization, like, yeah, you might lose some people, but who else are you going to gain? Right? There's this, and not to detour, I'll detour a little bit to answer that question. There's a big push right now, and some people in the US and the animal rights world of collaborating with fascists, seeing opportunities to make inroads, particularly against animal testing, by working with some far right folks that, for whatever reason, want to champion that cause to show that they're not just absolute monsters, I would argue, right? And the narrative is, well, we need to build a bigger tent. Anybody can be an animal activist. We need to build a bigger tent. I'm like, cool. When did we try to build a different tent that had all of these different causes in it? When did we build a tent that had farm workers and people like Helen and indigenous folks and folks that are protesting Black Lives Matter? Like, where was that tent before we start building another one to try to bring in the far right? Like, I just think to me, that is the dominant talking point. This is going to be tough. Not everybody's going to be on board, but maybe not everybody needs to be on board. Maybe we're seeing in this moment in history that's kind of a litmus test of where you're at. If you want to turn the other way to Black and brown folks being snatched off the street, like, I don't want to be in a movement with you. And I'm sorry if that's shitty to say, but I just can't anymore. If you want to say that trans people don't have rights, or you don't want to talk about them, you don't want to talk about Gaza, like, maybe we're not in the same club. And I don't know, I'm saying that more vocally now, in part out of frustration and in part because I think we all need to be saying them. Like, I think there's so much more to be gained. And to be clear, to make these connections, it doesn't mean showing up in, Black churches that are organizing for like civil rights and being like, well, you all should be vegetarian and vegan. Please don't do that, right? I think the model, when I talked about in Green is the New Red, the Shack campaign, some of the prisoners and activists I interviewed, when they were getting hit with really severe government repression, I mean, they were the #1 terrorism investigation, period, in the US. They went to the Black Panthers. And they didn't say, hey, you should do this, this, and this to be like us. They said, we know that you lived through this. And like, we just want to listen to you. And we want to learn from you. And we want to show that we were inspired by you, even though you might not understand what we're about. Like, we're down. And we want to be, receptive to what you can teach us. To me, that's the path forward. It's humility. It's honesty. It's like showing up to listen rather than to preach. And I think if we can move in that direction, I personally have seen the amazing collaborations that can come out of that. Just being not being a jerk, or doing the best we can to not be a jerk. Like, it goes a really long way. So as a long-winded answer to that, yeah, I don't want a bigger tent with fascists. I think we have a lot of other things.
Just to steal the mic for a second about what you were just saying. So I'm doing research right now on the development of cellular agriculture. And so, for example, the Good Food Institute, which is based in the US but international, you see them moving towards working like with the US military. And like, this isn't even making a comment about all of the partnerships with occupied Palestine, the apartheid state of Israel. So we don't necessarily need a bigger tent sometimes. That's all I want to say about my part. But we have a nice question. In everyday conversation, how do we get otherwise kind people to bear witness to at least the things we can change? So, for example, what we eat.
We don't begin to have the best like toolkit for that. I mean, I struggle with it. And in part, the new project kind of grew out of that. I move in a lot of spaces, both from growing up in Texas, like PTSD recovery groups with a lot of veterans and military folks. I've been in competitive weightlifting, and it's not like lefty vegan right? I was, in the book, I talk about going to motorcycle mechanic school. I was gonna give up journalism and do that. Also not that type of space. But I say all of that to say that one thing I've seen personally is the number of, and these are mostly dudes in these spaces, who have said some variation of, we've never talked to somebody like you. And that is like the best compliment to me, because what they're really saying is, we've never heard or allowed ourselves to hear the types of things you're saying. But because we trust you and you're kind of a dirtbag like us, we want to hear what you have to say. And that's led to conversations about politics and the far right and what I do and journalism and everything else. And to me, that's the model. It's just like whatever, as you move around these spaces, and I would encourage you to try to get out of your bubbles, right? Because if we don't, and going back especially to the young men, if we're not trying to reach people like that, I tell you what, the Nazis are. 100%. They are just snatching them up. And every time we think that we can't have that type of conversation, or we can't raise these things, or they feel excluded or judged or talked down to, I guarantee you there's a lineup of far-right groups that are more than happy to explain things to them. So I think it goes back to that kind of just being authentic. Like, we don't have to talk all the time. And I think, especially in those types of relationships or family relationships, you build trust first with your presence and then with your values, right? It's showing up is how you build relationships. And especially showing up to listen or to help. Once people see you doing that, all of a sudden it's like, okay, maybe, Will is our like leftist extremist defending terrorist friend, but like he helped us move, and he's like working on bikes with us and doing these things, and all of a sudden we're talking about that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I don't know how to characterize that, but it's just, I don't know. It's a very messy, and to be fair, there are also relationships that I think you have to cut off. And that's a very personal thing. I've done that with both some family and some friends, and it's like whatever you can handle, like your personal bandwidth. Like, it's not on you to just fight these fights all the time. Like, you have to protect yourself in a way too.
Thank you, Will. I'm Gabriella. I'm very struck as well with this talk about seeing things from a more systemic lens, which very funny. I work in food justice and I'm thinking about this a lot, but I never actually made the connection of how we think in silos. Silos are an agricultural term, so that just blew my mind a little bit. But this lack of ability to dismantle silos and to think of things systemically is kind of the trademark of the system itself. It's kind of like scientific atomized thinking. We can solve problems by looking at them very granularly and thinking of very technical solutions. And we have a hard time with this larger systemic narrative building, which is a big thing that you talk about as well. And towards the end, you said that coming back to faith was something that helped you handle the scope of this entire project. And I'm working in food justice. I'm also doing a study in the law and how property and the way we define property and personhood is enmeshed in the entire global legal system and is kind of a foundational myth of the United States and North America in general as well. And tying that into Quebec a little bit too, we're going through a big secularist movement, which is a way of burying the religious structures of our legal system as well. Because we say, oh no, we're secular, but we have God is named in the Constitution, and we have a cross that hangs over the legislature, and it's not actually a religious, it's just named secular. So this all kind of shapes how maybe the conversations that we need to be having are the ones that we say it's not polite to have, which is very much about spirituality and religion and is there a God and what would God do with all this stuff, and things that we tend to say, oh, this is very personal. We shouldn't tell other people and we shouldn't talk to other people about what their religions are. but maybe we should be talking about that because it's all tied in, and the narrative has to be of such a scale that it has to sort of encompass everything. And what else encompasses everything if not our very spirituality and our conception of like, why are we even here in the first place? So I'm wondering if you could make a comment about that.
Yeah, no, I thought that was beautifully said. And I think to maybe take it a step further, that narrative, the Little Red Barn, I think is a very Judeo-Christian narrative as well. I mean, it's very much baked into, you can imagine the Bible and the farmhouse, right? To connect to that silo analogy, when we're thinking about a path forward, it strikes me that the narrative of the Little Red Barn is, as you might imagine, quite problematic, right? But at the same time, when you go to farm sanctuaries, they also have the Little Red Barn, right? When you go through family small farms that are trying to do the right thing, they also have the Little Red Barn. And I think there might be an entry point there of not, how do I say, in these conversations, in some ways reassuring people that we're not trying to like eradicate everything they've known. It's a shift in how we think about these stories that we've been taught. Like the narrative of the barn itself isn't the problem, or even these narratives of faith that we have. It's how they're manipulated, I would argue, by people in power, right? So to connect that to like the sanctuary, those silos are largely on bigger operations. If you go to a small farm or a sanctuary, you don't have thousands of pigs in one place and thousands of cows over here. You got chickens that are climbing up on top of some of the dairy cows, right? You got the pig that's kind of the asshole running around the farm, terrorizing the goats or what have you, right? It is interconnected and messy. And I just think that's kind of a nice metaphor of the mess that we're in, that we don't have to come up with this really straight-laced solution. We can see how all of these things are climbing on top of each other and interconnected. To the point on faith in particular, boy, I've struggled with that. Like I said, I never did well with the Catholic Church. I was like in college and beyond, pretty militant, obnoxious atheist. There's been a lot of reasons for some of my shift. I'm not a religious person, but I have started to use that S word of spirituality or of faith in different ways, in part because I don't want to cede that ground to all of those other people. And I think doing that and not being able to have a conversation that connects with how people were raised is just making the work so much harder for us too. So when I talk to folks, I try to be open of like, okay, I understand these aspects of where you're coming from. I come from that too. We can keep some of these narratives and abandon what we don't need and what's not serving us and keep the things that are. And I know that's not the most helpful answer. But to me, I think that's the most like personally, like existentially solvable one. Is like we need some of these stories to navigate this world. Like we as human beings, I go into the research in the book of we're storytelling animals. I would argue what defines us as humans is not our ability to feel pain. It's not that we care about our offspring. It's not that we communicate. It's that we tell stories across space and time to shape our perception of reality. As far as we know, we're the only species that does that. So we, I think, have to hold on to those stories that can still give our life guidance and meaning. And the best we can reclaim them, or in some cases, I think we have to fight them outright.
Okay, so from Maggie. Hey Will, thank you so much for speaking out on this. If there was one thing you wish you could see in government, or if there was one thing Congress could do to move the needle towards more accountability, what would that be?
Resign. I mean, as you might imagine, my thinking is heavily influenced by anti-authoritarian politics. And I think more and more at the end of the book, I'm talking about kind of these converging crises of authoritarianism and climate collapse. And I think the only way we get through that is through community and mutual aid. The one thing I've seen, thank you so much. The one thing I've seen across all of my work, whether it's crisis reporting, natural disasters, factory farms, far-right groups, secret prisons, military, I keep hearing this phrase that at some point, people always realize no one is coming. That's the phrase, every single time. And when I talk to my veteran buddies, they're just like, hell yeah, man, no one's coming. Like everybody, refugees, migrants I met with in Turkey, they're like, no one is coming. And it sounds like such a dark statement on its face, right? But it's this shift of realizing like, oh, those people that say that they have jobs that are defending us and protecting us, they're actually not going to be the ones that save us. We're going to be the ones that save us. Like literally us in this room, the relationships and the people you meet here are what are going to save us, spaces like this. So to answer that point, I have absolutely no faith in elected officials. I think there's cool stuff happening. I mean, Zoran just won in New York City. Like there's potentially possibility there, but I think we have to mitigate it with some realization that that's not the goal. This is a tool. The goal is actually empowering our communities. And so, yeah, I mean, to give like a non-smartass answer to that, which is actually how I feel, but it's a little bit more nuanced because it's like, you know, I think transparency and accountability, actually responding to the values of working like everyday people rather than industry. If we could get any shift in that space of like political funding in the US with Citizens United and corporations, like, God, like to me, if I had that magic wand, it would have to start someplace at that intersection of industry and politics, corporations and politics. If you can start separating them, that's where it creates space for community action and like true resistance. Sure.
There's a question over here. Yes, go ahead. Can you speak up? Can you just come here because the microphone is actually on the ceiling here.
Do you think that globalization is one of the main causes of the ill treatment of animals, farm animals? And we see it in the European Union at the moment with the killing of thousands of cows under the pretext of the nodular cow disease. My last question, are you in favor of totally banning meat?
Totally banning meat.
Banning meat in our daily consumption.
Well, so to your first point, I would argue globalization is and neoliberalism in particular is a key driver. I don't think is the sole factor. And I say that because if you look at the history of the shift from smaller farming to industrial agriculture, it was not really under that like neoliberal globalization model. It was under just old school barren capitalist model, right? Of trying to consolidate power, demand efficiency, demand faster slaughterhouse speeds, more production, all of that. Where globalization and neoliberalism comes in is that model of factory farming has been exported around the world. It's being fought heavily in Europe right now. It's starting to pop up like in Australia and South America and other places. But in addition to that, like in China, it's kind of on steroids. That model is being ramped up to the point they're now building skyscrapers of hog farms that can have dozens of stories of animals stacked. Now imagine those farms that I showed and just layering them one on top of each other in buildings. And so it's complicated because I think it's a mix of those things. It's, capitalism is the problem, but also under globalization, those flawed models can be exported because everyone else wants a piece of that puzzle. They want a piece of the pot. They want some of that money. And I would argue also, that's something I realized in my first book, that we have to remember globalization because corporations have no national boundaries. And so when they move freely, when Smithfield goes over to China or JBS, right, these international conglomerates, they take their tactics with them, right? So when I testified before Congress, that GlaxoSmithKline representative was flown in from the UK to testify about an American counterterrorism law. That's, to me, the scale of what we're talking, what you're indicating. To your second point, I don't know, and in part because I don't think that would ever be a successful pathway. I don't think that's in the cards in our lifetime or the next several lifetimes. I think there might be possibilities of like radically shifting our diets because we'll have to. I mean, there's been powerful research out of Oxford and other universities that even if we adjusted transportation and all other private sectors, if we don't address food, we will not meet climate thresholds. Like it is not possible to meet it. So I guess to answer your question, I think a more persuasive way, rather than kind of feeding industry narratives that like we want to deprive people, we want to force our values, might be more of just a community organizing public education campaign. I think would be more viable.
I saw one question in the I saw one in the room and we have one online, so perhaps we have 10 minutes left. We can take them together and.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay. So part of it is I should just read your book when I get your book, but I'll just ask one of those questions. I wanted to know a little bit more about the legal framework that you're discussing. So something I was following for the last few years has been on the way in which laws just transform very quickly to deal with the resistance. So you have pushback against like the classification of these kinds of, well, different kinds of forms of resistance as anti-terrorism. So like what's happening in Canada, you get more fines, for example. So and in the US, the ideas of critical infrastructure for environmental protests, I know that there was a possibility after 2020 that food industries were being classified as critical infrastructure during COVID. And so I just don't know, is that because some people don't take into consideration how crippling these fines are for individuals and for organizations. I mean, they're just in the millions, right? Sometimes. And I just wondered, is this part of the trend? Is this something that's happening globally? Is this just the United States, not just throwing people away, but, economic terrorism and then economic response?
That's a great point. And to Kelly, she referenced in the introduction, that critical infrastructure narrative, and particularly using it to go after both environmentalists and First Nations, it is the playbook. And I would argue it's a direct extension of kind of how I've seen things step by step expand with things like ag-gag. So to give you a quick teaser of that, some of the latest or more recent iterations of these ag-gag laws dropped mentions of factory farms and animal agriculture entirely. And I know that's been the case in parts of Canada as well, right? That in part that was in response to the campaigns and arguments of animal activists and journalists saying, you can't single out one industry for special protection. Like we have due process, like equal protection under the law. So the industry responded by saying, okay, it's illegal to have any documentation of private property. So in North Carolina, that law passed, and it would wrap up if you investigate a nursing home, a daycare center, abusing children, a veterans hospital, critical infrastructure, right? So this is how the creep happens. I would argue that it's essential and critical that this began with very marginalized groups like animal and environmental activists, right? And then within those movements, it went more mainstream to things like photography, nonprofits, civil disobedience, and now it's expanded beyond these movements to things like critical infrastructure, regardless of someone's motivation. And from there, the next expansion, you know, we could kind of piecemeal it, but I think it's what we're seeing right now in the States. There is no other trajectory. You keep chipping away at the right to dissent from marginal to the mainstream to more and more social justice groups. That paves the way for an all-out authoritarian push because it's normalized. And that's what we're seeing in the States. Like there's been restrictions at first on like slaughterhouses during COVID. Trump didn't want to round up, use ICE to go after factory farm workers and slaughterhouse workers because this recognition that like, oh, we have to keep this going. So we'll exempt it for now. You see what I'm saying? Like it's like they're trying to figure out their own narratives as they're expanding this.
And the final question.
Final question, no pressure.
And I think it's a really nice way to end this. And it perhaps will resonate with a lot of people. So you talk in your book about how you were first exposed to animal cruelty as a teenager on a TV at a punk show. Can you talk a bit about how your experience in punk and hardcore culture was important in shaping your perspective on animal rights and your politics at large, and how important it is to have these spaces, especially for youth?
Yeah, I couldn't have stacked a better final question. Yeah, in the book I talk about like I'd been an activist in other social movements, and a friend, I had a punk show at the college radio station, I was 18. And a friend of mine, we were walking to the radio and she just kind of said, hey, you give a shit about all these other things. Like, have you thought about this? She didn't push. She was just like, here's a book. She gave me Diet for a New America. And I went vegetarian. And then at that hardcore show, in the time in the late 90s, in the punk and hardcore scene, there was this, I don't even know how to describe it, like kind of an all-consuming focus on militant environmental and animal activism. And to me, that shaped me in a lot of ways. Going back to that kind of masculinity conversation of feeling like I was a total weirdo growing up in Texas when that was too effeminate, too whatever, didn't fit in. And then I found these spaces where like the hardest bands at the time, the toughest people were talking about like not just animal rights and environment, but feminism and patriarchy and anti-war. I was like, okay, like this is where I feel at home. Like this makes sense to me. So at that point, spaces like this are transformative. Like I've talked about in both of my books now that the influence of the punk and hardcore scene on these movements is absolutely critical to understanding these movements themselves. In particular, because in punk and hardcore, there's such an emphasis on do-it-yourself politics, right? If you want to be in a band and you want to go tour Europe, just go tour Europe, right? There was a zine when I was growing up called Book Your Own Fucking Life. And it was a list of venues all over the world. And it's like, hey, reach out to these places if you want to go do a show. And like when you're an 18-year-old kid, it's like, oh my God, we can just go do this. We can screen print our own t-shirts. We can learn how to book our own venues. We can buy our own spaces. And that, I mean, if you look at the arc of my career or my life's work or whatever, has been that. Like mainstream media outlets wouldn't write about the stuff that I saw happening. So I started my own news service. I couldn't get like more like mainstream organizations to partner with me. They didn't want to be associated with radicals. So I started booking events internationally through venues like that. It started with like community churches and punk basements. And then it got, you know, bigger and bigger to government hearings and beautiful venues like this where we have like wonderful food, right? And so I just want to air that because I think it's so important, both that DIY ethic, that we remind ourselves that both no one is coming and we can do any of these things. We don't need a permission. We don't need special training. We don't need, you know, elaborate resources. It is incredible what you can do with small handfuls of people that just are passionate and want to help each other and do what they care about. I'm reminded of one of my favorite writers is James Baldwin, and he has this essay where he says, love has never been a popular movement. And I think what he's saying is that we think that historically the civil rights movement or the fight against Nazi Germany or whatever grandiose cause reaches a critical mass and people are in the streets and we're taught in history books that then culture changed. That's never what happens. It's always that more punk spirit of handfuls of people saying, we're not doing this anymore. And we're going to take action, whether it's in our community or outside of the law or some other creative tactic to get this done. And I think that, to me, like, I feel quite old in a lot of like hardcore shows and stuff now, but like I still, it's very much part of my identity, because it's both shaped my politics and how I view the world, and also I think is a continual fuel for my own agency, if that makes sense. Like with this book, I don't know, I didn't feel like I had any business trying to stitch together all of these different piles of research. And in part, it was that kind of punk ethic of, you're not going to wait on somebody else to do it, just give it a shot. I know that's not the most like poetic way to end this talk, but I don't know what else we say right now. As we're seeing these like existential crises, we just have to take it upon ourselves. No one is coming. We have the agency and the power and the authority in rooms like this to do what we need to do. And you'd be amazed in just try to reach out to a couple people in this space tonight. Maybe this is how we'll end it. Growing up in the Catholic Church, the one thing I remember is Father Beaumont would always say in Fort Worth, you'd have to shake hands with the people to the left of you and to the right. Introduce yourself to the people behind you. So as I'll let this devolve into chaos as you all do this right now, and hopefully you will a couple people to continue this.
Right, stand up.
So before we end, I would love to say a few words also, because in this book, Will talks a lot about Upton Sinclair, his book, The Jungle, how it changed a lot of things in the US. And he says at one point that we can all be Upton Sinclairs now with the technology that we have. I just would love to add that we should all be Upton Sinclairs. We can all do that. I want to tell you a little quote from Will Potter. He said, the reason activists are a threat is not because they are breaking windows, it's because they are creating them. So I would love to talk about activists who are actually creating windows in Quebec. If you go to the website besa.quebec, you will see they just released a new investigation with some undercover reporting. It's a documentary of 23 minutes covering major production here in Quebec by activists from Projet Coexistence et Solidarité Interespèces. So if you can share it, the more we share it, the more people will be able to see it, and the more things will change. And also, I just want to add on a sad note, I just learned that Open Rescue hero Zoe Rosenberg from Direct Action Everywhere in the US, she got 90 days in jail. So I'm very sorry about that. We have had a couple of big wins with Open Rescue people being freed and charges dropped and stuff like that. But this is really a loss. So all my heart goes to Zoe Rosenberg and to all of the activists who are going to the slaughterhouses and the farm. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Well, now it's picture time.
Oh.
I want a picture. All of you.
But one could take a picture.
Yeah.
It's just like